"Isn't that the grandma who passed away?" asked the billionaire's adopted daughter. The question hung in the glittered hush like a pebble dropped into a perfect bowl of crystal. Fawkes paused, laughter thinned. In a room built to hold 1,000 graceful lies, a 10-year-old's voice split the surface. Luna stood at the edge of the ballroom, where light pooled in chandeliers, and the city's night slid against the other side of the glass wall. A clean, unblinking sheet that separated polished marble from sleeping bodies on the pavement below. She had the look of someone who knew the truth of things people worked very hard to ignore. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical knot, a small hand curled around the edge of her father's sleeve. Pedro's jaw tightened in the way someone tries to stop a thought from leaking. Across from him, Fernanda smiled with the patient cruelty of someone who had practiced mercy and found it inconvenient. Luna's words did what her father's lawyers and his PR team could not. They made visible the people outside. For months, the gala had been rehearsed as a performance of charity. Hors d'oeuvres, speeches about the work being done, a silent auction whose price tags read like half-worlds. Through the great glass wall, a dozen figures lay wrapped in blankets, faces soft with sleep, or the hard, practiced neutrality of the unsheltered. The wall reflected chandeliers and coats, and the sheen of $100 shoes, turning the world outside into a pale, distant painting. Luna's eyes were on one woman beneath the overhang, a figure in a moth-eaten coat with a scarf tied improperly around her neck. But what pinned Luna like a needle was not the coat or the scarf. It was the glint of a small, transparent stone cradled in a makeshift string at the woman's throat. The collar, an ordinary clear stone set in a humble pendant, had been the only thing to survive the years when everything else had been taken from Maria de Los Angeles. To Luna, it was proof, memory, and stubborn, private love. The stone her grandmother had clutched when she fell asleep on long summer afternoons. The thing she had tucked into Luna's palm at bedtime when the house felt too big. "Luna," Fernanda said softly, her fingers tightening around Pedro's arm in a way that suggested ownership rather than affection. Not now. But Luna had been practicing courage like a muscle. She stepped around a server's tray and down the corridor, the carpet swallowing the sound of her shoes, but not the electricity of the moment. Guests parted with a kind of bothered courtesy, eyes skimming the girl as if she were a curious animal that had wandered into an illuminated room. Outside, the air tasted of metal and cold. The city pressed in without apology. Luna crossed the pavement with a child's urgency, fast, direct, and stopped a few feet from the woman. The woman's hands were clasped around a paper cup, fingers knotted and red from the wind. When Luna crouched, the woman's face lifted like a curtain pulled back. There were shadows of memory in those eyes, names drifting in and out, fragments of recipes, the weight of a lifetime on the thin planes of her cheeks. Luna's breath hitched. She reached out and touched the pendant at the woman's throat. The stone was cool and smooth, threaded on a frayed string that could have been knotted by any hands. Up close, it looked even more familiar. Not precious in a way the guests might notice, but exact in every way Luna had kept in her head. Without thinking, she put it to her cheek as though the touch would read a record somewhere inside her. "Abuela," she whispered. The woman blinked, and something small and tragic and beautiful unspooled in her face, recognition without knowledge, like hearing a lullaby you no longer remember the words to. She smelled faintly of lavender and rust and the stale sweetness of too many city nights. For a second the woman smiled, slow and bewildered, and Luna felt the world fold inward under that simple act. The glass wall was no longer an image. It was a barrier someone had to cross. Luna stood up and gripped the woman's hand. Inside, the ballroom was a stage of polite panic. Fernanda had risen like a predatory bloom, and her smile had thinned into something surgical. Pedro's face had changed from glossy manager to a man trying to remember his lines. Whispers threaded the room. Few people dared to tie the look on Luna's face to anything other than a child's fancy. She pulled, and the woman came. For an instant, those wrapped blankets on the pavement became a procession, small tragedies made visible. Luna did not think of etiquette or consequence. She thought of the way her grandmother had hummed while she braided Luna's hair, the way she had tucked notes into Luna's school lunches, the warmth of a hand that taught Luna how to knead dough into shapes. That hand had been taken from their home like a word erased from a book. By the time they reached the doors, someone made the wrong choice. A host, flustered, reached for a tray of champagne. A guest pivoted, laughter dying mid-breath. The woman's arrival in the ballroom cut across the polished choreography like a sinker through silk. A server's elbow clipped a glass, wine arced through air in a slow, terrible fountain, darker than the chandeliers, a living, fluid smear across a smiling man's suit. The sound of liquid striking fabric seemed too small for what it did. It broke the sheen and splashed doubt right onto the polished event. A hush dropped. People looked first at the stain, then at the woman, then at Luna, finally at Pedro. The partner whose endorsement Pedro had courted for months sat rigid, his tie doused in wine and his face a mask of indignant surprise. Cameras, phones held by eager guests or covert reporters, tilted in unison, their lenses hungry for scandal. Fernanda moved faster than anyone expected. She stepped in front of Pedro as if in defense, but the action read as containment. "This is inappropriate," she said, every syllable polished. "We have security." Luna's voice did not shake. "She is my abuela," she said. "That is her collar." The word collar in that room seemed to have weight. People dialed back their curiosity into discomfort. Some looked away, eager for the spectacle to be smoothed over. Others glanced toward the glass wall, where the sleeping figures outside were not the subject of conversation, but the source, sudden and awkward, of this evening's drama. A woman in a silk dress crossed her arms as if to hold in all the things she did not want to think about, where privilege met obligation, how appearances devoured truth. Pedro felt a pull in his chest that was not just embarrassment. It was the strange, cold talk of guilt, that private engine pushed by small, ordinary decisions made long ago. He had loved Maria de los Angeles in a particular, unpreventable way, for the steady, human things she brought into a life otherwise tilted by business and grief. When she had fallen ill, Pedro had been capable of 1,000 things except the simplest courage. He had let other hands lead the decisions. He had signed papers in a sterile office because someone had told him they were necessary. He had heard somewhere the carefully crafted line, "We are protecting her dignity, Pedro." It becomes easier to believe lies told by people who look like they are saving you. Now his daughter was dragging what those lies had hidden like a lantern into the center of their rehearsed generosity. "Pedro," Fernanda said, close enough now that he could smell the expensive soap she used. "We can speak privately. This is not the place." Not the place. He wanted to say that the place was everywhere, that the glass wall reflected not only light, but decisions, that the gala and the sleeping figures outside were the same problem wearing different disguises. But instead, he found himself making the kind of murmur that buys time. "If this is real," the partner said, voice sharp, "we'll need proof. We can't jeopardize the auction." Proof. The word sounded small, practical, and somehow violent. Proof could be manufactured from a story or shredded by a signal. It was currency in a room built to exchange reputations for donations. Fernanda's head inclined slightly. The camera phones moved closer. A woman near the buffet gasped and began to weep, a private thing loudly performed. Luna did not have a lawyer's patience. She held the woman's hand in both of hers, and in front of a roomful of the rich and polite, tugged the collar free from the scarf and held it up. The clear stone caught the chandelier's light and split it into honest little blades. For Luna, the pendant was not a prop. It was an anchor to a life that had been declared lost. "That's it," she said. She gave it to me. Someone in the back muttered about security. A server hovered ready to fetch staff. Pedro felt his empire, vast, obstinate, made of contracts and men who bent toward profit, crack along a seam that had always been there. He could feel the eyes of his board on him, the tally of what this would cost in cold numbers. For a breath, he imagined his lawyers drafting statements, Fernanda smoothing the edges, and life returning to a prettier, safer shape. Instead, a bottle of red wine toppled in the commotion, and the liquid slid like a quick accusation across the floor and over a partner's suit. The sound of fabric sucking up wine was almost obscene in that room, a private mess made public in full color. The man who had backed Pedro's expansion into the new market rose like a wounded bird and flapped an indignant hand. "My suit!" he cried. "This is unacceptable." Fernanda turned her charm on the man, honeyed and sharp. "We will cover it," she said. "Please accept our apologies." Her words were balm, but her eyes were steel. She was already measuring damage control. Luna's eyes were on her father. "Why did you let them take her?" she asked, loud enough for some of the guests to hear. Pedro's mouth opened to a practiced answer and closed again. He thought of the stack of medical bills, the whispered counsel that had arrived when grief left him thin and raw. He thought of how Fernanda had appeared, effortless, helpful, a safe hand at his back, and of how, one by one, people who had loved Maria had been pushed aside with polite explanations about consent and best care. He thought with a slow, wrenching clarity of every favor he had traded for comfort. "My lawyers said it was for her best," he said finally, voice small and tangled in the chandeliers. "We thought—" "That's the thing," Fernanda interrupted, her tone too bright to be genuine. "We thought too many things. Now is not the time for accusations. We will verify her identity." Luna's small fingers were still white-knuckled on the collar. Around her the room smelled like the wine, the rich spill, sharp, expensive, unforgiving. A murmur swelled, some taking the girl's side as a romantic notion, others shifting their discomfort into the safe place of mock concern. "Help her," Luna said simply. "Please." A server stepped forward with a nervous attempt at aid. An older woman in a tailored dress muttered about decorum. Fernanda's smile thinned and refocused like an instrument. She turned to a waiting aide and whispered something quick. The aide's face tightened. An acknowledgement, a command, something meant to carry the problem away. For Pedro, the sight of the woman in his daughter's arms was a blade of the purest kind, not accusation, but an invitation to remember. He remembered bread that tasted of slow work, a kitchen warmed by small hands. A lullaby hummed into a house that used to be a home. He remembered being too busy to notice the small erosion of trust, the way a kind voice had pushed contentment into the shape of control. Working memory is a poor ally in crisis. It stutters like an old film. He knew he needed to make a choice, step forward and face the consequences of the past, or step back and let Fernanda smooth everything into a nicer image. He wanted to be noble. He wanted to be sensible. He wanted anything but the thin helplessness winding up in his chest. "Pedro," Fernanda said again, this time with both hands lightly on his forearm. "Please, discreetly. We have donors to placate." At the edge of the crowd, Luna's face tightened like a fist. She was a child, but in the stubbornness of her grief, she had an intelligence that made adults in the room uncomfortable. She had watched what wealth did to her father, how it made him generous in headline and stingy in truth. She had watched the way Fernanda's influence spread, how staff disappeared, how stories were smoothed over, and she had kept a collaged archive of memory, bread, laughter, a pendant warmed by night. The knowledge that one could be removed in a single, polite meeting was a horror she could not abide. "I'm taking her to the quiet room," she announced, surprising everyone with the assurance in her voice. "No," Fernanda said sharply. "You are not. We will handle this." Luna's reply was a single fierce syllable. "She trusts me." A cluster of people shifted uncomfortably. Trust was a private currency they did not understand. The partner with the ruined suit looked at Pedro with the bland, incredulous caution of someone whose investments suddenly risked scandal. The cameras lingered like flies. Some guests smiled with the practiced sympathy of people who had never had to face betrayal. Luna led the woman, Maria de Los Angeles, if the stone and Luna's memory were to be believed, toward a small curtained study near the ballroom. The room had been set aside months before for private conversations and quiet donations, a space of soft chairs and tasteful paintings. In there the air was warmer, but the walls were thin, and the events in the main room were not closed off from the murmurs. Though the room offered a modest refuge, it was still an island within a sea of composed faces. Inside, Luna sat close to the woman. The pendant hung at an angle, raw against skin that had lived hard winters and empty pantries. The woman's name, Maria, settled into the space as if someone finally had the courage to say it aloud. The woman hummed a melody that pulled at Luna like a rope from an old life, words loosed in halves and pieces. For a moment the child felt no need to explain anything else. When they emerged, the study's curtain swayed behind them, and the night spectacles rushed back. Fernanda was waiting. Her posture was immaculate. Her eyes, though, had the trace of a plan that had not included a 10-year-old child with stubbornness. "We will verify her identity," Fernanda said with the insistence of one arranging chairs on a sinking ship. "For now, Pedro, please, keep this contained." A flustered aide materialized at Fernanda's side, and as the server fussed with napkins and the partner dabbed at his wine, a man in an unremarkable suit moved through the crowd, accompanied by someone whose presence made Pedro's stomach twist with a premonitory chill. He recognized the man as Ricardo's type, groomed too carefully, eyes that measured a room the way one might size up a safe. Ricardo himself was not here yet, and that was telling. The man's jaw set with the kind of resignation men wear when they have been given an ugly task. From the corridor a voice called, "Sir, there's a press near the west entrance." Fernanda's smile stayed in place. "Thank you," she said. "We will handle it." Luna did not see the meaning in all of those words. She felt only the strain of arms around a small, fragile human being and the rising ember of anger. Who were the people who took grandmothers away and wrapped the theft in paperwork? Who smiled and kept their hands clean by passing responsibility to others? She thought of the sleeping figures beyond the glass wall and the way the chandeliers reflected them like a painting. The wall was clear. The world inside had simply chosen to not look. "Dad?" Luna said softly, looking straight at him where he stood a little apart, the conversation around him making neat arcs. "You have to do the right thing." The right thing. Pedro's life had been balanced on the margin of that concept for years, drafting philanthropic letters, walking ribbon cuttings, signing sealed papers in exchange for quiet. Making the right thing happen would mean admitting past wrongs and opening doors that had been shut. It would mean disrupting investments, calling to account people with far more to lose in reputation than he did. It would mean listening to his daughter's small, raw voice. Pedro could not respond. The room closed upon them, the society of people who had spent decades perfecting the art of not seeing. The cameras tilted. A reporter near the glittering dessert table whispered into a phone. Someone snapped a photograph as Luna held the pendant up like an accusation. On social media, a single image. Luna's small, determined face, the collar shining like a tiny absolution, would later travel in a flaring, hurried way. But in that moment, the image stayed inside the room, and that was enough to make certain things happen. Fernanda made her move. With the precision of someone who had rehearsed consequences for every conceivable embarrassment, she approached Luna, her voice sweet as glass. "Dear, this must be handled carefully. You should sit with Miss Julia in the drawing room while we call her doctor." Miss Julia, the kindly matron who ran the household's protocol, nodded and offered a seat. It would be a soft entrapment, the sort that wears down dissent with civility. Luna shook her head. "She wants to go home," she said. "She wants to remember. I won't let you put her away." Fernanda's smile did not falter. "There are legal processes." "Legal processes?" The phrase hit like an accusation. Outside, in the city's teeth, someone coughed and the night continued, indifferent to declarations inside grand rooms. A staffer in an immaculate uniform approached and gently took the woman by the elbow, intending to steer her out of the center of attention. At the sight, something in the woman's eyes flickered, the semblance of fear or confusion. She tugged away from the staffer's hand, suddenly small and vulnerable with Luna's stare upon her. "Please," Luna said, and her voice contained a truth that had no armor. "She has been taken from our home. She lived with us. She knows me." The aide looked between Fernanda and Pedro, and then at Luna, unsure. Guests renewed their attempts to appear amused by the spectacle. The partner with the ruined suit huffed and adjusted his jacket. The room waited for the embarrassment to be smoothed out, for a line to be read, and for the night to continue. In the crowd, a woman fumbled for her phone and began to record. The first CTA, so small and so modern, was already forming. The image of a child in a collar would be ready to move like a seed into a public field. Someone in the room made a short, sharp sound. A staff member said, "We can bring medical staff discreetly. That's best for her." Luna felt her father's hand on her shoulder. It was not a command or a comfort. It was something else, a weight. She looked up at him and found in his face a hurricane of regret, a man who had surrendered to expedience until the sum of it had come due. For the briefest of moments he looked like the father she needed, small, open, frightened. "Let her be examined here," Pedro said, his voice carrying at last the shape of a choice. "Now!" Around them there was the rustle of relief and the rustle of displeasure. Fernanda's expression was a carefully smoothed mask. For the first time that evening she had to recalculate. The aide who had been given the task to act blinked, and somewhere in the room a plan began to reform easier than one would expect, containment rather than confession. As two discreet medics approached with a medical bag and a clipboard, people the house had on call for guests who were unwell, one of those polite luxuries, Luna felt the world tilt. Her small hand tightened on the pendant until the fabric of the string creased. She had a sudden childish impulse to protect it, as if the memory of her grandmother could be stolen again by the simple act of looking away. Someone pushed a chair forward and offered it ceremoniously to the woman. She sat, unsteady and quiet, hands folded on her knees like a map of a long road. The medics asked gentle questions. The methodical concern cleaned some of the theatre from the edges. Luna watched them, not with the impatience of a child, but with the steady focus of someone who had decided to hold a place open in a world that would prefer it closed. Fernanda crossed her arms for a fraction of a second, then released the pose. She leaned towards Pedro. "We'll need to make a public statement," she murmured. "Say that we are conducting an identity verification. We cannot allow false claims to damage tonight." Pedro opened his mouth to agree, and then did not. The silence between them was the measure of everything that had happened and everything that could happen. The partner with the stained suit cleared his throat and moved off to speak with his lawyer at the edge of the room. Guests drifted into clusters, their conversations shrinking around the small epicenter like ripples. Luna felt the room wanting to close around the woman, to tuck her into an orderly box and hand the situation back to the house with a bow. She thought of the sleeping figures outside the glass wall, and the way the light from the chandeliers skinned across their blankets as if to make them pretty. Her stomach tightened with a resolve that had the simplicity of a child's moral arithmetic. When someone is taken, you fetch them back. She stood, and quietly but with a firm authority that stunned several of the adults, said, "I'm not leaving her." Fernanda's eyes glinted. She moved like a predator that had been named. "You're making this difficult, Luna." "Some things are worth being difficult about," Luna answered. The sound of the comment travelled through the room. Some smiled awkwardly at the bravery of a child. Others, whose lives hinged on the polished machinery of reputation, closed their faces like bank vaults. Pedro felt the red line of something break in him. He had been a man of cautious decisions. Now the cost of caution had been paraded like a debt in front of his child. A man in a plain suit, one of the household's longer-serving staff, approached. His name was Fagundes, and he had been at the house long enough to remember the smell of cooking that had once filled the halls, the laughter of family dinners, the way Maria had kept small rituals that made the house home. He had watched the slow rearrangement of people in the house, the whisperings, the silences that replaced songs. He had been loyal because loyalty is a thing that requires a body and a heartbeat. Fagundes's face was the kind you trust without a thought. He knelt beside the woman and took her hand with absolute care. "Señora Maria," he whispered in Spanish, a language that had lingered like honey in the household for decades. The woman's head turned slowly, and for a moment there was a shard of clarity. She smiled in a way that made Luna's ribs hurt. The small human scene was a rebellion in itself. Fernanda's fingers tightened on a champagne flute as if she might crush it. She leaned in, smiling like someone arranging a photo to hide the dust. "We'll need identification," she said, turning to Pedro in a voice that implied he could sign any paper necessary to make everything go away or turn into a manageable storm. Pedro swallowed. In his chest, something like shame opened and reached. He could sign 1,000 forms and call 1,000 people to make the problem disappear. Or he could let the truth, untidy and loud and dangerous, run its course. He thought for one small, suspended second of Maria's hands in flour and her humming in the early morning, and the depth of his cowardice when others convinced him decisions were for the best. "Let's at least call the doctor," he said finally, his voice brittle with the weight of the choice. "And we should call the authorities." Fernanda's eyes cooled. "Authorities?" she repeated, as if testing a new word. "Yes," Pedro said, "just something official. We can't have people making claims in the middle of a gala." Luna, clutching the pendant, looked at him with an astonished mix of relief and disappointment. The girl who had dragged a woman through a diamond-lit room, expecting rescue, did not yet understand the architecture of grown-up defense. But she understood loyalty. She understood that men like her father existed in a space between principle and the cost of principle. Outside, a taxi idled briefly at the curb. In the glass wall's reflection, the sleeping forms were small and anonymous, but present. The pendant at Luna's throat glinted. The medics murmured into their hands. A phone in the corner flashed with a message. In the edges of the room, life prepared to resume its performance, but not before a few threads had been pulled loose. "And if she's not who you say?" Fernanda demanded finally, her voice a wick of anger. "Then we will apologize," Pedro said. It was the kind of answer that could mean everything or nothing. People nodded, and the partner with the stained suit managed a brittle smile, as if to say the evening might yet be salvaged. Luna watched them and felt, for the first time in a long while, the weight of being the smallest person in the room with the largest truth. She thought of the pendant and the way its clear stone could hold a memory like water holds a leaf. She thought of Maria's hands and the sound of her humming, and she resolved that the story would not end under paper and protocols. As the medics prepared to take the woman into a small private room for an examination, a shadow moved near the curtain. Someone had drawn near with the quiet efficiency of people who had been paid to keep problems politely contained. A man with a face like a crossword puzzle, Ricardo, the chauffeur whose service had been repurposed into something closer to a job description that included secrets, lingered by the door. His eyes flicked to Fernanda, who touched her earpiece and gave the ghost of a nod. Luna saw the exchange in a flash that felt like a bell. She did not know Ricardo's habits, but she understood when someone in the room, especially someone with Fernanda's smile, decided to stop a narrative that threatened them. She stepped forward and squeezed the pendant until the cord creaked. "If anyone tries to take her," she started, and her voice was small but iron true. Fernanda's smile sharpened. "Nobody is taking anyone," she said, with the kind of certainty that had been used to turn away questions before. But outside, beyond the glass wall, the sleeping forms shifted. Someone coughed. The night breathed on, impartial. Inside, the orchestra of society prepared to play on, slightly out of tune. Pedro looked at Luna then, really looked at her, and the sight of his daughter's fierce, unbowed face pierced more cleanly than any accusation. He swallowed the shape of the decision he had to make. He reached for a phone. Luna watched the screen light his face and felt the room tighten like a throat ready to sing. She held out the pendant one more time and, in that simple act, made an argument no one in lacquered shoes could quite ignore. Some things once seen cannot be unseen. The medics moved toward the woman, their hands gentle, and the curtains of the small room drew closed. At the far side of the ballroom, the partner whose suit had been ruined muttered that his appearance at the auction was no longer certain. A photographer's phone flashed, and somewhere outside, the night swallowed the sound like an ocean. Fernanda exhaled a breath that tasted of calculation. She stepped away and, in a voice that could be mistaken for tenderness, said, "We will manage this." Down in the lobby, a uniformed security officer received a call and looked up with something serious in his face. Ricardo leaned toward Fernanda, his presence a dark promise. Pedro tapped quickly at his phone, fingers moving in rhythms that once meant deals, and now felt like something else. A trembling apprentice trying to learn a new craft called accountability. Luna stared at the place where the curtains shivered closed, and made a small vow in the hollow of her chest. The vow was not a big one. It did not require speeches or lawyers. It simply said, "I will not let them take her again." As the music in the ballroom tried delicately to resume, as people gathered their napkins and their dignity, as Fernanda's smile hardened into a mask she wore with the ease of habit, someone at the edge of the room whispered, "Call the police. For identity verification, yes, and also for safety." Pedro's thumb hovered over the phone screen, the cursor like a held breath. He thought of Maria's laugh and how it had once filled the house, thought of the times he had chosen ease over courage. He set the phone down. Outside, in the pale light that pooled around the sleeping shapes, the glass wall did what it had always done. It mirrored the room and hid the people pressed against it. The pendant at Luna's throat was a small, loud truth. And in a back corridor, someone said very quietly, to nobody and to everyone, "Make sure she doesn't leave." The words were a trapdoor sound, the kind that opens and drops everything into motion. Luna didn't hear them. She heard instead the small, certain voice of the woman beside her, humming a fragment of a song she almost remembered. Luna held the pendant as if it were the only map she had left, and with the stubbornness of a child who knows the difference between what is right and what is easy, prepared to follow where it might lead. The curtains had barely closed when a low, precise command slid through the room like a chilled current. "Make sure she doesn't leave." It was the kind of instruction that dressed itself in concern and left no room for mercy. Luna heard it as if from underwater. She clutched the pendant until the frayed cord ached against her palm and felt, with the childish clarity that sometimes pierces adult confusions, that the evening had unfolded onto a hinge. Either someone would stand with the small, shivering truth in their hands, or the truth would be folded away into papers and polite sentences. For a breath, Pedro hovered between the two choices. The little authority he had left, authority he had thought he'd bought with donations and named wings, trembled. He had, in 1,000 ordinary ways, traded away a fiercer integrity for comfort. Now that bargain looked cheap and brittle. "If this is real," a voice had said earlier, "we'll need proof." The word had sounded clinical then. Now, in the corridor outside the curtained study, it felt like an accusation. Luna watched the medics ease the woman into a private room and remembered how the pendant had caught the light, splitting the chandeliers into honest, small blades. She made a decision that did not require strategy or adult sanction. She would not let Maria be swept away into paperwork or a quiet home that never quite let her be herself. A second later, and without any public deliberation, Luna slipped loose from the neat choreography of the gala. She moved like a small animal that knows it is seen but continues anyway. No one stopped her. No one who had the interest to stop anything inconvenient. If this story moves you quietly, subscribe and stay with us. There's a lot more to see. Night had thinned to a sharper edge by the time Luna slipped into the service corridor. The festivities in the ballroom bled muffled laughter and a violin that tried its best to admonish the moment into something elegant. Here, back-of-house lights hummed and the air smelled of dish soap and the sharp tang of coffee someone had long ago abandoned. Fagundes met her at the door as if he had been expecting her. His face, broad and kindly, softened even more when he saw the pendant wrenched to a nub between her fingers. "You sure, Nina?" he asked, half Spanish, half the voice of a man who had learned to weigh truth like a commodity and then realize its worth could not be counted. "I saw her," Luna said simply. "She has the collar." Fagundes looked at the curtained study, then at the band of brighter light under the ballroom doors. He felt the old household like a skin, places where laughter had lived, places where it had been smoothed over. He had watched the house change hands as if hands could be instruments of pressure, pressing old things into new shapes. He had not always agreed with how things had been done. Loyalty had never meant obedience to cruelty. "All right," he said. "I'll go with you." They moved like ghosts between the kitchen's ordered chaos and the private rooms. A vacuum of obligation seemed to open as they passed staff, who for the most part had learned to look down when the house needed to be spared from scandal. Fagundes kept a hand near Luna, no condescension, only an older man's protective instinct. At the curtained room, the medics were gone, leaving only a small card on the door that said, in discreet handwriting, "Observation." For a moment they stood in the charged silence. Inside, the woman, Maria de los Angeles, sat in a chair, hands folded. The pendant lay on her chest like a small piece of quiet. When she saw Luna and Fagundes enter, her face softened and a fumbling smile arrived like sunlight through broken glass. She reached up with a slow, thinking motion and brushed the pendant as if to anchor herself. "You came back," she murmured in a voice wrapped in cobwebs and honey. "Yes," Luna said. "I'm not letting them take you." Fagundes smiled without relief. There was too much at stake for relief. Outside, far above them, the ballroom blew false confetti of conversation into the night. For the next 2 hours, the room became an island of small, brave decisions. Pedro, who had not yet recovered the spine required for public martyrdom, came and sat down on the opposite chair with the slump of a man who had lost a ledger of worth. He watched the woman as if watching his own life pass through a window pane. Tears came quickly and without stage direction to his face. Fernanda arrived later, as if the event were something she had scheduled. Her clothes were immaculate, her makeup intact, and her voice a calm instrument. "We must be cautious," she said, every word carefully proportioned. "There's a legal process." Her hands never trembled. She had always known how to turn difficulty into a detail to be managed. Pedro looked at her with a blank, private fury that swam beneath the surface of his manners. There was a squeeze of shame he had not expected. It felt heavier and more intimate than public shame because it named debt in the language of memory. "This is her," Luna said to him, holding the pendant as if offering evidence at a table of law. "This is my abuela." Someone outside had called the police because the corridor phone lights blinked, and then a voice said the words, slow and formal. In the hour that followed, the tone of the house changed. The small false calm in Fernanda's smile thinned to a hardness. She made a call and spoke softly, her voice the practiced whisper of someone who arranges exits. For the first time that night, Luna heard behind the hairline smile the rustle of a plan. They were still seated when Fagundes inclined his head and quietly told a small truth. "They will try to move her." Pedro's shoulders shuddered. "We called the police," he said, as if naming them gave their presence weight. It did not. Processes are not always swift when they contend with wealth. "It may not be fast enough," Fagundes said. "They move quick." There was a long silence filled with small decisions. Pedro had never been arresting in his courage, but the sight of his daughter, small and bright as a struck match, had the kind of moral pull that makes some men find language they had misplaced. He stood up and walked toward the door. "Whatever you do," he said, voice thin, "do it openly. No tricks." He meant it as a direction. He meant it also as a warning to himself. The police arrived in a lull between conversations, in a polite shuffle of papers and questions. An officer, young and conscientious, asked for the woman's name, details, and proof of identity. Documents were requested, and in the making of that list, 1,000 built-in defenses were exposed. Fernanda produced something elegantly, old healthcare records, a name signed in a firm hand. Luna watched Fernanda's fingers move, the same hands that had once tied a scarf around Maria's neck, now smoothing paper to make a story plausible. Outside, as shadows pushed along the curb, a van idled. It was black and unremarkable. Men who do unremarkable work often dress their deeds in unremarkable things. Ricardo was there, his jaw a hard line, as if he had swallowed his conscience and felt it grinding in his throat. The officer had barely left the study when Ricardo's presence became a small form of violence, a quiet threat dressed as efficiency. Luna's skin prickled. She had not imagined men in suits and dark cars would materialize so readily. She thought of the earlier whisper, "Make sure she doesn't leave," and the way those words had thoughts attached to them, plans with steps. The pendant in her hand felt both small and explosive. When Ricardo stepped into the corridor with 2 others, voices dropped to efficient murmurs. Fernanda smiled in that way of hers. She looked at Ricardo and, for once, a flicker of something like impatience passed her features. "We'll handle this," she said. Luna's solution was as sudden as a child's. She stood, grabbed Maria's hand, and stepped lightly into the corridor, the pendant swinging like a compass. "We're going for a walk," she told the men who moved like shadows. For a second no one moved. Then one of Ricardo's companions reached out. Luna was small and fierce. She pulled away with the kind of reflexive speed that comes from having spent a long time expecting injustice and deciding to avoid it. The hallway became a corridor of motion. Pedro lunged. Fagundes shoved a hand in front of a man. Ricardo pushed back with the economy of someone used to giving orders. And in that instant, everything that had been careful and measured inside the house spilled into an ugly little storm. A security officer, called by a nervous aide, came in dragging protocol and the language of procedure. He stood between the men and the 3 who guarded the edge of the house's private world. Someone called an ambulance. Someone else, less confident, called a lawyer. Voices rose and fell like a temper on the edge. "You cannot leave," Ricardo said quietly, as if stating a fact would be enough. "Yes, we can," Luna said and pulled again. Her small hands felt as if they could carry grief like a parcel if necessary. That was when Fernanda chose to change the stakes. In a motion that felt premeditated down to the practiced breath, she leaned forward and, with a smile sharpened for the purpose, announced she would take Maria home herself, to attend to her personally. The man who had been employed to move things quietly had his lips thin. Pedro, who had been standing at the edge of the scene like a man learning to be present in a life that suddenly demanded it, saw the movement in Fernanda's face. He felt something, an old muscle of protectiveness, rise up and push away the soft ease he had accepted for so long. "No," he said, and because his voice for once rang with more than apology, it moved people. The officer, obliged to be cautious, but also to be reasonable, asked for documentation of Fernanda's care plan. Fernanda produced it in a silk-smooth way that closed 1,000 potential openings. She pocketed the documents like someone tucking away armor. Pedro saw the curves of the knight's route collapse into a new shape. Legal forms could carry a body far from the home it once held. He felt the slow, helpless affliction of a man who had been too willing to allow others to make decisions for him. "Fine," he said finally, the syllable heavy. "We'll go to the police station and file something. No one leaves the building until—" But even as he said it, the small van outside began to move, a slow, patient glide that seemed to take for granted the human lives it might displace. Luna saw it from the window, like a dark beetle pushing away from light, and felt a grief like a small hand closing over her heart. That night, when the formalities settled into the pattern of bureaucracy, Maria was, in a sense, taken. She was moved with the kind of efficiency that treats a fragile human being like a folding piece of furniture. They said it was for her safety, for a quiet place to rest, for doctors who could see her without the glare of the cameras. Police forms were filled with the antiseptic phrases of care. Pedro had signed lines that later read like 1,000 concessions, permission slips that looked like compassion. Luna stayed awake with the pendant cupped in her palm. The house exhaled and repaired its surfaces with practiced gestures. Fernanda's smile resumed its place like a polished coin. Outside, the city breathed, and the sleeping forms beneath the glass did not know that someone had been wrenched away. The weeks that followed made a slow corridor of months. The official line hardened into a narrative, a private, quiet decision made for the woman's best interests. A statement about an accident spread into funeral flowers and a notice in the paper. Many people, some with sympathy, some with relief, resumed the performance of their lives. Luna refused to accept that what she had seen and felt could be reduced to a paragraph in a private ledger. She saw in Fernanda's guarded smile the shape of something cold as ice. She knew that power would prefer the tidy end. If the house had a heartbeat, it had been rerouted. So Luna began to build small rebellions. She learned, in the spaces adults left for children, the ways in and out of the house, where receipts lay, where a forgotten ledger gathered dust, how a calendar could hide a printed string of names. She read the small prints with the alertness of someone hunting a ghost. She spent afternoons asking questions the adults would not answer. Who signs what, where staff had gone, why certain nurses had been there then never seen again. She watched Pedro's phone and learned the tilt of his voice when he negotiated things that left him emptier. Fagundes, who had not entirely surrendered his loyalty to the house's new shape, slipped her scraps of memory and time. Names of aides who had been let go, a cook who had been made to leave, small facts that later threaded together into a picture. When she was turned away at the door of a building that claimed to have cared for Maria, Luna felt the particular suffocation of truths never shown. They had returned one artifact, the pendant, returned in a small belligerent envelope with a note that said, "With terrifying civility we returned what was significant." It was a small, terrible mercy. Months thickened into a dust of paper death notices and a sense that something permanent had been carved away. But the pendant had not been silenced. It pulsed in Luna's pocket like a stubborn heartbeat. It was Fagundes who finally brought an opening. One damp morning, when the sky had the color of old paper, he slid into the kitchen and left a small scrap of paper folded into a careful square. The note named a place, an underpass by the river, where people without homes slept on Tuesday nights, and a name, Marta, a woman who traded bread for coffee with a dignity that needed no permission. Fagundes had always known the paths between people. "We heard a woman ask for eggs," he said quietly, when Luna looked at him. "They say she hums sometimes. Maybe that's nothing. Maybe it's everything." Luna's skin tightened with hope like a wire pulled taut. She arranged a plan with the cunning only children can muster. Asked the house for permission to accompany a charity run. They would not say no to a good photograph, and slip out when the running group was distracted by cameras. Fagundes would meet her at the underpass. That night, under the skeletal sweep of bridges, she found people whose lives had been rearranged by misfortune. They were not props. They greeted one another with the ease of people who share what little they have. Marta, the one who often traded coffee for bread, sat wrapped in layers and hummed to herself as she mended a sweater. Her hands moved with a steady, practical grace. At first, Luna thought she had mistaken a dozen small signs for something else. The woman who hummed seemed younger than the Maria she remembered, but something about the face, the hands at least, carried the same work-made solidity. Then Luna felt the pendant when she reached out and knew it was the same small stone. She stepped forward and crouched. "Abuela?" she asked. The word felt like a key. The woman's eyes blinked, and for a moment 1,000 memories loosened with it. A laughter, a recipe, a braid, a song half-remembered. She looked at Luna, then past her, as if remembering a road that had been cut. A small group gathered, people who had experienced the city's underside and learned its manners. They were cautious like animals, but curious enough to help when someone small, like Luna, asked. They did not simply accept her claim. Marta was not some piece of property. They watched how Luna held the pendant, how she spoke to the woman with an intimacy that time had not thinned. That sudden recognition turned into practical action. Someone offered a spare coat, someone else boiled water and offered tea that smelled faintly medicinal but warm. Luna sat and held the woman's hand until the story seemed to reweave itself into a feasible shape. Marta and 3 others, women who had become de facto family, moved with an efficiency that was not unlike care. They shielded the woman when they sensed danger. They offered routes to safety, and when Luna spoke of the need to take the woman somewhere people might listen, they nodded. "It's not the first time someone disappears," Marta said in a voice that had seen too many good things taken. "But if you bring her into the light, people with more to lose will show up." Luna nodded. "She needs a doctor," she said. "She needs someone to listen." They decided, because there is a stubborn, honorable law among people who have been overlooked, to go to the station and tell the truth. They would walk in and name names, tell where the woman had been and demand someone look. This is her. She is alive. The homeless woman, Maria, sat like an old ship that was suddenly recrewed. She touched the pendant as if to confirm that a piece of her past had not been stolen after all. The trip to the station blurred into the thick, bureaucratic world that has a habit of asking the wrong first question. But there, at last, a young officer listened. He listened in a way the silent rooms of wealth seldom do, with a professional patience sharpened by a chronic shortage of theatrics. Luna told him everything she knew, small details unrolled like a map, the pendant, the gala, the van. Marta and the others corroborated, using their own voices and their own names. When the officer asked if the woman could identify herself, Maria called out, slow at first, then with the thin certainty that comes when memory stitches itself back together. "My name is Maria de los Angeles," she said, and the words were like a bell in a church that had been closed for a long time. "I lived with the Pedros." The officer made the appropriate notes and promised action, but promises had texture when wealth got involved. In the days that followed, the city's small systems moved. Forms were filled, interviews scheduled. When Pedro received a direct call informing him that someone had come forward to say Maria de Los Angeles was alive, his reaction was complicated and terrible and full of the human contradictions that make for slow salvation. He could have hidden. He could have smoothed the papers so that nothing public would come of this. Instead, he did something that had been rare in recent months. He felt his guilt as if it were a separate, fleshly thing, and he let it be visible. He went to the station. News travels, especially when there is a small alarm that wealth cannot silence. In a few hours, a reporter, drawn by the small, improbable story of a child who would not be silenced, arrived. Cameras that had been so ready to look away now leaned in. Once news leaked, the currents of consequence began to move quickly. Fernanda's reply was immediate and elegant. She produced receipts, forms, a paper trail made to look like compassion. She spoke of best practices and confidentiality. Her voice had always been a blade wrapped in silk. Now she used it to attempt containment. But the story no longer belonged only to the drawing rooms and to the neat piles of legal forms. It belonged to an alley, to a pendant, and to the faces of people who refused to be invisible. Under pressure, truths reveal seams. A nurse who had once been paid by the household, dismissed quietly, appeared at the station and gave a statement. Her hands shook when she spoke of how the care plan had been rearranged, of medications changed without explanation, of a schedule that made the woman sleep at odd hours. She did not give names in the first interview. She did not have to. The pattern was a kind of record. At the center of the growing net of testimony were the pendant and a handful of people who had refused to let the story close. Luna was there, small and steady. Fagundes stood like a living ledger of old loyalty. Marta and the women from the underpass gave their accounts with the dignity of those who had nothing to gain from invention. The police moved to follow leads and demanded records. Lawyers on both sides prepared statements. The narrative that had been convenient for one part of the household began to fray. Fernanda saw the danger, and for a moment something like panic slipped under her face. Her plans were not built to survive public inquiry. At night she met with Ricardo and, in whispers, set contingencies into motion. The choice to flee was brief and cold. Impression management was no longer possible if the law leaned in. On a rainy afternoon, when the sky had the energetic impatience of a city that knows its weather will not be asked for permission, Fernanda left the country house. She did it cleanly, with the sort of arrangements that people with resources make: a bag, a passport, an exact itinerary. She told no one she trusted. She only set into motion an exit route designed to dissimulate responsibility. Ricardo, who had until then moved through the household as part guardian and part instrument, joined her. His loyalties were transactional. He had protected a household's secrets for pay. In the end, loyalty bends to the balance sheet that best suits the moment. Pedro learned of the planned departure through a network of men who had once done his bidding. The information hit him like a fist. He had been someone who used money to get things done. Now he was a man who had to see if money could yield the same results. When the moral calculation had shifted, he tried to stop them. He called the police and told them what he knew. In a small, important reversal, he did the thing he had avoided for too long. He chose to make his complicity public. Fernanda and Ricardo, however, were not small people to be detained quietly. They left before the net closed, driving a car through the rain, engines a low, industrious sound. The chase that followed was less a cinematic ballet than the blunt, bureaucratic reality of men in cars trying to outrun consequence. Police cars followed, sirens marked the distance. Friends of the household called in favors, but the universe had already moved to a point where hiding was harder. Nobody in that chase wore the face of triumph. It thudded through the city like an uneasy wind. Fernanda's driving had the cold, controlled apathy of someone who had always believed she could control fate with a firm hand. Ricardo sat beside her, hands stiff on his knees. The road curved out of the city toward a cliffside that, as many stories in the world's newspapers remind us, is beautiful and cruel in the same breath. The car's final moment, the one that would later be reported without intimate detail, was a bitter punctuation. It left the road in a way that the concrete of bureaucracy would record and the newspapers would phrase carefully. The car veered off the cliff and was consumed in a blaze off-screen. There was no relish in the description. Reporters used measured language. No graphic details were offered. People who had been hurt by treachery learned, in that moment, that consequence sometimes arrives in the shape of abrupt finality. The world, however, rarely serves up poetic justice on demand. The event was an end, and not a tidy moral answer. Ricardo's absence was felt less as an elegy and more as an unfastening of a mechanism of harm. Fernanda's fate, rumored, reported, shrouded in the language of accidents and investigations, changed the shape of the house's possible future. People in the business community who had once made polite calls to Fernanda stepped back, because they too must attend to reputations. But if there was a single true change, it was not the absence of the villain. It was the reappearance of what had been abused and the publicness of the reckoning. Maria had been found, people had spoken, and Pedro, imperfect and late, had told truth enough to matter. The police completed their report and made arrests where necessary. In the wake of the chase, there were investigations and hearings and the sorts of formalities that try to exert order upon chaos. Doctors examined Maria, giving her time and medication, and in a steady sequence she regained more of her memory. It was not instantaneous nor miraculous. It was an accumulation of rest, proper care, and, importantly, people who insisted she be listened to. The moment of public clarity, one the papers loved because it had drama but not gore, arrived at a municipal hearing where the city was obliged to listen. The room thrummed with press and with lawyers who polished the edges of words to be strategically blunt. Pedro stood at a lectern and spoke like a man first stumbling toward confession. He did not cast himself as hero. He said he had failed. He said he had been afraid. He named the small human acts that had been callous, ignoring concerns that had been whispered, letting convenience displace curiosity, and most of all, letting a woman he loved become invisible. Maria sat in the front row, the pendant at her throat like a calm talisman. For weeks the fog had lifted in places, days when she remembered the shape of dough under palm, and the names of those she once fed arrived like small mercies. The hearing room was full of formalities and procedural constraints, but when Maria's voice arrived, it left no room for the smooth distribution of responsibility. "Yes," she said, with the gentle authority that had shaped the household's kitchen for decades. "She called to me. She told me I could not cook on my own. She kept the meds. They told my son, things in a whisper, and he believed them. I was taken." Her words were not theatrical. They were the testimony of a life that had been edited. The microphone had the small official tick of the city's machinery, but Maria's voice carried the weight of a woman who had been heard. Luna stood near the podium, small and sturdy, like a stake hammered into the ground of a new truth. When asked if she had anything to say, she stepped forward and held out the pendant. "This is what my abuela gave me," she said simply. "We gave it away once, and they gave it back in an envelope, but she is alive." Maria, at that moment, touched the pendant with a hand that had been steady with work. The sight of it in Luna's hand seemed somehow to bring together the scattered pages of memory. She looked up, and the room tilted into an odd, intimate quiet. "Her name is Fernanda," Maria said, and the sound of the name was not bent with fury, but with a small, steady fact. She told me it was for the best. She is the one. Those two words, Fernanda is the one, moved like an instrumented flash through the crowd. Fernanda, who had once managed the household with the cunning of a well-trained surgeon, had to face the publicness of accusation. There was no stage for a secret now. The city's apparatus had leaned in. Fernanda, who had not been at the hearing for the simple reason she was no longer present in the city, was the subject of many reports. Ricardo was gone. Some people whispered about fate, others about accountability, but everyone understood that the story had rearranged the terms of the household. For Pedro, the hour was unbearable. He listened to the testimony and admitted, with a voice that cracked, that he had been complicit in a slow theft of dignity. He denied being the hand that took his mother from home, but he admitted to the moral failure of allowing others to cast votes for him. Public confession, sudden and raw, cost him social currency and possibly business deals. It cost him less in the long run than a life built on evasion. Once Fernanda's flight had been realized, Pedro made the decision to reorder his life. He did not do it theatrically. He moved with a clumsy, earnest energy. He rebuilt who he was around small things. He took Fagundes back into the house with a proper contract and a full salary and public recognition. He rehired the cook who had once been dismissed and apologized in a way that insisted on being more than a line in a statement. He called the staff into a meeting and listened finally with a humility that was not practiced. The family, raw and imperfect, started to stitch back together. There was no immediate perfect mending. Maria's recovery was intermittent, like a light warming up slowly. There were days she could not remember a name. There were others when recipes came back like an old language. Therapy, specialists, and the slow work of rest were necessary, and they were honored. At the same time, a public conversation began. The city's papers ran pieces about the glass wall, the metaphor from the gala that had made Luna's question so searing. They wrote about the way we let distance become a fence, and how sometimes a child's insistence can force adults to behave like adults. People beyond the household reached out. Donations poured into a modest fund Pedro established in Maria's name, not for the family's public image, but to support an actual project, a shelter that would be transparent in ways that mattered. It would be called the Casa de Angeles, a name that insisted on remembrance without decoration. The plan was not a headline coup, but a practical infrastructure. Beds, medical care, a stable staff that would be hired for dignity rather than pliancy, and a board that would include voices from the community the house had once overlooked. Luna watched the building plans with a changing chest. She wanted more than chairs and beds. She wanted the glass wall, once a symbol of division, to be used in a different way. The new center would not have a glass wall that hid people from view. It would have windows that invited the city to look and participate, and a courtyard that opened invites rather than barred doors. The idea of transparency was not about spectacle, but about removing the furniture that had been placed between people. When the shelter finally opened, months after the gala, it was not a gala for the press. They avoided a ribbon-cutting show. Instead, they held a quiet morning where people who had been through hardship were invited for breakfast. Maria walked in, steady and for reasons that took patience to sustain, luminous, and took the hands of the women who had helped her while she was gone. Fagundes stood at the entry with the dignity of someone who had watched the furniture of a home rearranged and then tried to rebuild it with care. Pedro stood to the side, significant and small. Luna took the pendant from around her own neck and, with a solemn grace that surprised even her, threaded it onto a new cord and held it out. The pendant had been a map, and it had kept a memory. She looked for someone who would wear it as a symbol of survival and care. She chose a woman named Carmen, who had, in the weeks before, led a group in the underpass. Carmen had the kind of laugh that made the kitchen small and the world larger. Luna knelt and fastened the pendant gently at Carmen's throat. "For what you did for my abuela," Luna said, "for the way you kept her safe." Carmen's eyes flicked with a small, surprised laugh. "Thank you, Niña," she said, and the sound sounded better than any ribbon cutting. Pedro spoke quietly to a small cluster of staff and to the people who had become partners in the shelter. "We will be accountable," he said, and the words were the work of a man who wanted to be more than a good headline. He announced strict hiring practices, an independent oversight board that included community members, and a fund to support medical needs without delay. There was in his voice a plea for permission to do better that felt honest. The building's windows faced the street, and for the first time since the gala, the glass wall no longer felt like an accident of class. It had been replaced by something that encouraged a look that said, "We are here, and you are seen." The final reckoning of the household's choices unfolded slowly. The press ran with statements, and people argued about the moral calculus of wealth versus responsibility. Fernanda's end was written about in dry dispatches that tried to tidy the chaos into a narrative. Ricardo's disappearance became a footnote. Legal processes continued, and where there was wrongdoing, there were consequences. Those processual realities did not give anyone absolution, nor did they measure the hard work of rebuilding a relationship. Maria, in the weeks that followed, recovered much of her voice. It came back in pieces, morning songs, a recipe that required no measurement, a recollection of a neighbor's name. Her memory did not return in a flood. It returned in small, beautiful increments. She forgave in a way that was not theatrical. She forgave more often by choosing to teach again, teaching the women in the shelter how to shape dough into small loaves that tasted like kinship. One afternoon, when the sky had the clear, bright kindness of a spring, Pedro found himself in the shelter's modest kitchen. He wanted to do something unspectacular, wash vegetables, carry water. He moved with the awkwardness of a person relearning a simple craft, and as he worked, an old rhythm reknit itself little by little. People who had once been excluded now had voices on the board. Fagundes took a managerial role with the blunt insistence that actual care required management, not just the appearance of it. The cook returned and stood at the stove like a queen regaining her seat. There were small parties and quiet acknowledgements. Pedro apologized publicly and privately, and the apologies were not perfect, but they were real. He set up a fund specifically for the staff who had been dismissed without cause, and made sure their medical bills and wages were handled. That kind of reparation was not a theater. It was a daily payment on a debt. Luna watched all of it with the same steady moral clarity that had defined her since the restaurant incident months ago. At 10, she had become the axis of the story. At 11, she had become a kind of conscience. She was not satisfied. She wanted more long-term structural change. She spoke at council meetings with the kind of raw logic that made adults uncomfortable, and sometimes they learned from her. Years later, when the shelter had a full year of operation and a small, sustainable community, there was a modest celebration. No press stash, just neighbors and people who had been served. Maria was there, of course, humming as she distributed shallow, warm bowls of stew. She stood near the doorway and looked out toward the street, where a new glass wall, this one part of the shelter meant to let light in and to invite passers-by, caught the sun and turned the morning into a kind of promise. Luna had grown a little, the pendant at her throat, no longer the ragged string of a childhood object but remade with care, sat like a small, bright coin. Pedro stood nearby, less a titan than a man caring for repaired things. He had become a clearer presence in his child's life because he had been forced at last to be present in the only way that mattered, with contrition and sustained action. Maria came to the front of the small group and spoke without ceremony. "This place keeps people warm," she said. It keeps them with papers, with doctors, and with friends. It keeps them with food and with the chance to be heard. When she finished, Luna stepped forward and took the pendant from around her own neck. She smiled at the room full of faces who had once been invisible and held the small token between two fingers. Then she walked to an older woman at the edge of the circle, someone who had come in with a bundle and a soft, suspicious face, and she looped the pendant over the woman's head. "For strength," Luna said, simpler than any ribbon-cutting speech. "And for remembering." The woman's eyes shone. She touched the pendant as if it were a small compass. Around them, people clapped not for spectacle but for the small, honest thing they had helped to make. At the very end, when the dishes were almost done and the sun had shifted to the gold of an afternoon that felt like forgiveness, Luna walked to the now open glass that looked out onto the street. Beyond it, the city went about its usual business. Buses, vendors, the steady arc of lives. The glass no longer separated so much as connected, an invitation rather than a barrier. She thought of the night that had begun everything, the gala, the spilled wine, the pendant that had cut through the crowd like a small sword. She thought of the woman she had once found wrapped in a moth-eaten coat, and how that woman had reclaimed her name. "Isn't that the grandma who passed away?" Someone would still ask in a tone of disbelief, but now the question would land differently. People, tempted to believe a tidy headline, would have to reckon with the fact that lives are not so tidy and that children can see what grown people will not. Luna placed her palm against the glass. Outside, a figure paused to glance in. She was a woman who had once slept beneath the same lights the gala had reflected. She looked at the open doors and the hum of the shelter, and something like hope shifted in her face. Luna thought about the future, a future that depended less on dramatic ends than on steady work. Together with the people who had been hurt and those who had been willing to repair, she began to help shape it. There would be staff training and independent oversight and community input. There would be days when the old fear slipped back in, but also days of small graces. An elderly woman remembering the name of a neighbor, a man finding work again, a child learning to bake bread. Mostly there would be the pendant, a simple, transparent stone that had once been a private talisman and had become a public proof. It would travel now as a token of belonging rather than a talisman of loss. It would remind people that remembering matters and that small objects can hold large responsibilities. As light thinned into the forgiving color of late afternoon, Pedro came and stood beside Luna. He did not make a speech. He simply put an arm around her and for once let the gesture be enough. They watched as Maria moved about the room, humming and distributing cups. Her laugh, when it came, was as ordinary and as dear as bread. Luna adjusted the pendant at her own throat and felt the cord against her skin. The city beyond the glass was noisier and more complicated than any single story could catch. But inside the shelter there was a new rhythm, daily work, real compassion, the kind of accountability that lives in contracts and also in the tenderness of human presence. She had asked one small, rude question in a room that had been built to look away. It had opened a path to a long, slow labor of repair. In the end, the question mattered not because it produced a dramatic finality, but because it refused to let a life be erased. And as the front doors opened and a woman, newly fed, newly heard, stepped into sunlight, Luna smiled. She placed her hand on the glass wall, not as something that separated, but as an acknowledgement that the world beyond could be invited in. Some walls are meant to divide. Some walls, when removed or repurposed, reveal how much we were meant to be near one another. The pendant gleamed at her throat, a small clear stone catching the light as if to say, "Remember and keep remembering."